So, welcome to Philip Clare, who's going to speak on the overall effect of parental supply of alcohol across adolescence on alcohol-related harms in early adulthood. Over to you. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. So, despite the fact that alcohol is a leading cause of burden of disease, particularly among young people, one of the leading suppliers of alcohol to young people is their parents. Often that supply is based on the idea of teaching them responsible drinking, reducing harm later. So often comes from a good place. It's the parents trying to teach responsible drinking practices and discourage particularly binge drinking later in adolescence, which is where the harm is seen. But there's been very little research historically that's shown that that's actually an effective practice, beyond the fact that it at least seems to work in places like Europe, where that's kind of the traditional approach. So what I'm reporting on here is a study of adolescence. You've seen a couple of presentations already today from this same cohort. They're adolescents that were recruited about 10 years ago. And they've never been followed up annually for 10 years. We recruited them at about age 12 to 13, so mean age is about 12.9, in grade 7 from schools across the country. And they were asked a series of questions about their drinking, but also the sources of supply of alcohol. So from mother, father, friends, self-supply, peers, and so on. And we've done some past research that's looked at this sample that has already shown that, in fact, the idea that parental supply of alcohol is protective is a false one. Certainly, thus far, all of the analyses that we've done and presented and published has shown the opposite, that actually it increases the rates of drinking, binge drinking, potentially alcohol-related harm as well. But those studies, previous studies have thus far, have focused on relatively short-term effects of relatively simple exposures. So typically something like, does parental supply in the current year predict harms in the next year? So what I wanted to look at was a bit more of a long-term analysis across adolescence. This is also some work from my PhD. I'm also a biostatistician, so this was kind of also intended as a proof of concept almost for the drug and alcohol field of actually a method that was mentioned by Kriana, targeted maximum likelihood estimation, and in fact I have used the superlearner, but I'm not going to describe it. I will describe targeted maximum likelihood estimation briefly. Again, there won't be any maths. So the problem with looking at long-term effects of an exposure, so in this case what I'm looking at is the effect of parental supply across adolescence. So at the most extreme, what's the effect of a parent who starts supplying to their adolescent at, say, age 12 or 13, keeps supplying them throughout adolescence, versus if they had not supplied at all? The problem with doing that kind of analysis is that there's lots and lots of change in the middle. And the reason for that change can be quite convoluted, but also can be confounding. So what might happen is that supply leads to some kind of intermediate harm, which reduces supply, and then the harm goes back down, and so they increase supply again, and so on. So you can have really complex patterns of exposure. And that kind of pattern of exposure introduces bias that's really difficult to address using traditional analyses. So targeted maximum likelihood estimation is a very targeted causal estimate. And the way that it works is that it's a three-step process. So I might just get a show of hands. Has anyone know or has used propensity methods? Okay, no. All right. So the traditional regression approach to this kind of problem is just to put everything into a multinomial logistic regression or something of that form. Lots of predictors in the model with a binary outcome. And that approach has been shown in this case to be very biased, particularly where there is a lot of complex confounding, which in this case there is, just putting in the overall supply trajectory is quite biased. An alternative method that you can use is, instead of doing that traditional regression analysis, is to start by modelling the probability of exposure. So you start by doing a model of the exposure variable. You use that to create a probability of being exposed, and then you do a quite simple outcome regression method that just has the exposure and the outcome, and you weight by that probability. And that has been shown to be less biased. It's been around for about 20 years. It's very poorly used in the literature, but it's at least a step in the right direction. But there are situations where it doesn't do well. In particular, it's very reliant on the idea that there are no people for whom there was no exposure. So if you take particularly this is a problem when you have lots of covariates, where you have someone who, say, when you really break it down and you take males aged 12 from New South Wales in private schools and keep breaking it down, and what you end up is cells with 0. So in that group, there is no one who is exposed, or in that group, there is no one who wasn't exposed. When that happens, propensity models fail, or they're biased. So targeted maximum likelihood combines the two. It takes the outcome model, the traditional regression model, it takes the propensity model, you do both of those, and then you essentially update that initial model using the propensity score. So because another advantage of TMLE is that because you're not actually using the initial models, that initial outcome model and the initial propensity model aren't actually used, so the coefficients aren't used, you're just making predictions from them, you can use things like superlearner. So we can use adaptive machine learning techniques to make really, really highly predictive models, and it doesn't really matter because we're not actually using them for inference. We're just using them to make predictions, and then we take those predictions and use the inference. So I realize that was still relatively complex, but again, you have to bear with me, I'm a biostatistician.
We're still here.
Some very top level initially results. This is just the probability of basically of being supplied by parents, and you can see it's quite high. So even at wave 1, when they're aged 12 to 13, 16% of the sample were being supplied alcohol by their parents. And that increases to almost half by the time they're 16, 17. So parental supply is definitely happening, and it's happening at high rates. The outcomes that I've used in this model, or in these models, are assessed subsequent to that supply, so in wave 6 and 7 of the study, and they're also quite high. I should qualify some of these DSM-based outcomes in that they're self-report, so they're based on the city, but they're self-reported. So we've taken the city interview, but rather than administering it over the phone or face-to-face, we've turned it into a questionnaire instrument that they self-report. So we'd expect self-reported symptoms to be relatively high compared to the actual diagnostic criteria, because we can't get whether, for example, it's had a burden on their lives and things like that. So the things that would come out in a clinical interview that would actually lead to a diagnosis don't necessarily get reported. But nevertheless, we've got pretty high rates of self-reported harm, and even just self-reported symptoms of dependence and alcohol use disorder is surprisingly high. Almost by wave 7, almost 50% of them reported at least 2 symptoms of DSM-5 alcohol use disorder, which is probably concerning. So now moving on to the results. So what we see is that supply across adolescence, this is consistent with past findings, leads to increased rates of binge drinking subsequent to adolescence. So supply across adolescence, binge drinking at age 18, and also to increased rates of harm. Different to past results, past analysis has shown links between parental supply and the DSM outcomes, but in this case, those didn't bear out. So it's still not entirely clear from these results whether that's because those associations are short-lived or whether they're driven by very early exposure. So it may be that those results from past analyses are really that parental supply of alcohol at age 12 is very strongly associated with harm, but parental supply of alcohol at age 16 is not, and that it's being driven by that early age. But when we take the results across adolescence, it washes out. Certainly that seems to be suggested by the fact that by the time we get to age 19, essentially, wave 7, all of the effects of parental supply of alcohol have gone. So 2 years after the last kind of occasion of supply that's measured in this study, the effects have all washed out. This could also be simply because of time. So it may be that actually 2 years subsequent, the highest predictor is that wave 6 outcome. So it could still be that parental supply is having a role, but it's just being washed out by the fact that it's really the wave 6 version of the outcome that's predicting it and not parental supply. So still more work needs to be done. So the take-home message is, fortunately, I guess, it looks like parental supply of alcohol isn't quite as bad as we previously thought. We're not seeing effects, at least at the level of the kind of DSM diagnostic criteria. The rates of symptoms aren't particularly different. It still is associated with higher rates of binge drinking and alcohol-related harms, which are things like hangovers and getting into fights and things like that, so they're not particularly good things. But they're relatively mild in comparison to DSM criteria. Importantly, there's still no evidence whatsoever that it's protective in any way. At best, it does nothing, but at worst, it causes harm. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So Anthony Shakeshaft, who's Deputy Director of NDARC, as you all know, is going to talk about community-based responses to alcohol harm. Do they work, and where next?
Thank you, Hayden. So I'm going to be the anti-biostatistician and talk about using randomised control trials, and then you don't need the statisticians. They become irrelevant. Okay, so I've given way too much of my life to doing community-based research. And so I thought what I wanted to do today was just kind of reflect a little bit on where I think we're at with them and, what we might do next. So, traditionally there's been this sort of oscillation over time between, alcohol problems are an individual problem and we need to fix the individual, which is a line that the industry, the alcohol industry loves to push, versus the idea that there's, a broader kind of environmental influence that encourages excessive drinking. And of course, both of those are true. So we need to find ways to respond to individuals who have problematic levels of drinking, but we also need to, if we just try to focus on the individuals and we don't do anything about the sort of, structures that support problematic drinking, so that's, things like legislation, that I'll talk about some more in a minute, then effectively, we're just parking the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. If the laws are too lax and we let too many people drink, the exposure problem, more people drink, more people are exposed to more levels of alcohol, and then we're going to get an increase in the number of individuals that have a problem. So we need to do both. Systems approaches, I won't talk too much about those, but they, in my mind, are a way that we can do both. So we can kind of think about, from a treatment perspective, if we can get away from thinking about does what a GP does with a problematic drinker work, or does resi rehab for a problematic drinker work, if we can get away from that and think about the system of care. So how do we get GPs and resi rehabs and everything in between to work together in a coordinated way in order to improve the outcomes for individual problem drinkers? So that's that sort of systematic approach to working with individuals, but it also applies, I think, mainly around legislation and community action to a whole community approach, and that's mostly what I'm going to talk about today. We keep coming back to this idea. Whatever we do, whether we're trying to focus on individuals or we're trying to focus on whole communities, I think we're going to get much better outcomes if we find ways to tailor it to the individual people and individual communities. And that's, again, something I'm going to talk about a lot. So when we talk about legislation, does it work? And I think the answer, there's a few of these types of studies, and I think they show, that the answer is yes. So essentially what this is a graph where on the vertical axis is an evaluation of a policy score, and essentially what it looks at is whether how many how much regulation each country. This is done with countries in the Western Pacific. So it looks at how many alcohol laws those countries have and how strictly they're enforced. And the more laws a country has and the more they're enforced, the higher your score. And then on the bottom's just mean per capita consumption. So you can see it's a pretty clear pattern. So the countries that have more laws and enforce them have lower average rates of consumption. Whew. When we did that analysis, I was petrified it was going to, turn out to be the opposite. So legislation works, but it doesn't have an even impact across communities. So here's a graph of alcohol-related crimes across 20 communities that were involved in a randomised trial called ARC, Alcohol Action in Rural Communities, that we ran a few years ago. So you can see that the rates of alcohol-related crime are very different. So the laws are all the same, and they're the same, they're all rural communities, but rates of alcohol-related crime are very different. And it's also true of alcohol-related traffic crashes. So, the laws around drink driving are the same in all these areas. So the legislation's the same. But again, you can see there's a huge variability across communities. So it kind of makes a nonsense of saying, let's do the same thing to all communities. Okay. So why would we bother with community-based approaches? There's all the WHO have argued that they're important. The Australian government variously, when it's not pandering to the alcohol industry, says that community responses are important. And communities themselves, so when we did the ARC trial, we asked communities what they thought, 86% of them thought. So everyone thinks they're a good idea. And for me, because that's where the harm is, I'll put that in because there's a famous story I like of a guy who was a bank robber in the 1950s in the US called Willie Sutton, and he obviously wasn't very good because he kept getting caught. And after his 6th or 7th time or something, he was getting caught, and the magistrate said to him, "Why do you keep robbing banks?" And he said, "Well, because that's where the money is." So it reminds me of, we can do, for my money, we can do all the international and national studies, and they're important, and we kind of need to have that sort of global and national focus. But at the end of the day, where alcohol harm matters is in communities and in families. Like, that's where the harm is. That's where it impacts. So for my money, that's where we should be doing, I think, the bulk of our work. So do community-based approaches work? Hard to say. Probably, if you want to be completely optimistic. So when we first started doing this, I thought, there'll be lots of studies we'll be able to learn from. And that's what it looks like. So we could only find 7 randomised trials. 6 of those were in the US. But all 6 of those in the US, when you looked at them, they didn't actually randomise the community. So it was a school-based study, for example, where it was focused on the schools, and then they brought in elements from the community. So, what if we bring in the local people around the school who sell alcohol and get them to talk to the kids and, don't come in here buying alcohol, that sort of thing. And the other 2 were university campuses. So actually, we couldn't find one study where the unit of randomisation and analysis was the whole community. So ARC was the first one to do that. So actually, we kind of don't know very much about this, I think. So this is what I won't go through the detail of this because it feels a bit like ancient history, but it was the first time where we started to think, how do we tailor what different communities want? And I think this is, this was a bit clumsy, and I think we've got much better at it over the last decade. But essentially, this was sort of trying to say, well, what are the key areas that are going to be standardised across all communities? And those 3 things are the ones in red. So the thing that was common across all the communities was better use of data, focusing on high-risk groups, and trying to get more screening and brief intervention. But the sort of weight that each community gave to those was up to them. So they had to choose, they had to do something in the kind of high-risk groups, but whether they wanted to focus on schools or workplaces or sports clubs, they could choose. But they had to do at least one of those. That makes sense? So for me, this was the starting to get how do we get evidence-based and standardised interventions, but also allow them some flexibility. So did it work? These are the kind of key outcomes. The ones in the, left-hand column, they're the ones that were closest to significant. Some of those were significant, some of them, weren't 0.06. Can't remember which ones now, but maybe that's close enough to 0.05. I think it was Cohen, the famous statistician, said, God loves 0.06 almost as much as he loves 0.05. So let's go with that. The middle column and the right-hand column, probably not so much. It'd be a push to say that they were likely to be impacts that were, or outcomes that were a consequence of the intervention. So this just gives you a feel, because it was a sort of interrupted time series analysis, at least part of it. So what we did was look at, in this case, alcohol-related crimes across all of the communities. So the very top line is the control communities, and the bottom line is the line just underneath that is the experimental communities. And those first two lines are alcohol-related crimes. The bottom two lines are non-alcohol-related crimes. So what we wanted to show was that any impact on alcohol-related crimes wasn't just a function of shifting things from being alcohol-related to non-alcohol-related. So you can see there's not much going on in the bottom two lines. So that widening gap in the post-intervention period, it's still going up a little bit in both the experimental communities and the non-experimental communities. And that gap from memory, that might have been a 0.06er. So, after all that money and all that work, I was sort of chewing wasps about that being so close to significance. But there you have it. So I think that's the kind of impact, is community-based approaches effective? The way we did it, probably, but not overwhelmingly, it's not earth-shattering. And really disappointing this was we did a fairly thorough cost-benefit analysis as well for the economics, and I won't go through all the details, but if you look at the numbers down the bottom, the 1.4 to about 1.8. So what that says is for every dollar that was spent on doing the interventions, there was a return of somewhere between $1.40 and $1.80, depending on how you did the maths. So, is that, I think most people use a rule of thumb of around about 4 is pretty good. So it's okay, not great, but better than being the reverse, where it's, so it probably does work, community action, and it's probably, a good investment. So this graph, then we didn't ever quite get around to publishing this, but this is the rate of change. So on the first series of 10 communities on the left, they were the experimental ones. The next series of communities on the right were the control ones. So you can see overall there seemed to be more change, so more reduction in alcohol harms, or in this case, alcohol-related disorderly conduct. That's the one we picked for this. So you can see there's a sort of more positive change in the experimental community, so that's good. But again, it's really variable. So we're left with this thing of, rates of harm are really kind of vary across communities, but also their responsiveness to trying to do something about it also really varies. And why that is, who knows? So where to from here? Where do I think we're at with community-based approaches? So, the first thing I guess I keep coming back to is, why has no one done this before? Why is there only one? I probably got about halfway through this. I feel a bit better now. There's been a few years behind me, but it nearly killed me doing that trial, so maybe that's why. But then I thought so one question is to say, well, maybe they're just too hard, but maybe it's the wrong question. Like maybe what we're trying to do is say, here we did a randomised control trial with these 10 communities, nicely controlled, and we tried to measure fidelity and all the rest of it. And then if we had shown a good effect, we could say, now, therefore all communities should do this, that sort of translation argument. But maybe that's wrong. So maybe, what we should be doing is saying, how do we not sort of do these, create these, as ScoMo would say, create these artificial bubbles and, work in a kind of clinical trial almost context with communities. Rather than do that, let's just work with them where they're at and find ways to embed research into the things they do, their everyday sort of systems of operating. So if we did that, we'd be moving away from questions about, does community-based approaches work, to how do we organise things, services in communities in order to get an optimal effect. And the way you need to organise, the services and the responses in a community will vary depending on their baseline rates of harm. Yeah? So maybe that's a better question. And it kind of gets us into this sort of idea of we don't want to set up a trial or a way of evaluating communities and then walk away. What we want to do is set up a sort of infrastructure and we can use routinely collected data. So we've got A&E presentations, we've got crime, we've got hospitalisations, a whole range of things. And if we can set up a sort of infrastructure and use that as our sort of measuring or evaluation tool, and then we can test all sorts of things, continually within communities, pair them up to try one thing, untangle that one and then do another one somewhere else. Right, so we started to think about doing this in clinical settings, and we're sort of, for want of a better term, starting to call them something like learning systems. So how do we make, for example, GPs learning systems? So everyone that goes in to see their GP, the primary care system learns something from what happens to that patient. So we do the same thing with communities. How do we learn from what communities are doing? So what are some of the things that this might look like? So one of them is the key stakeholders in a learning system have to identify meaningful knowledge gaps. So it's not up to me to go into a community and say, you guys need to fix this. We've looked at your A&E presentations and they're out of control, you need to fix it. It's up to us to go in there and say, well, what are the problems that you are experiencing? What are you worried about? And then we'll go away and look at the data, see if we can find it in the data somewhere. And then when those things match up, so when what the community is expressing concern about and what we can find in the data are, matching or aligned, then we've got, a promising start to doing something about it. Identifying possible solutions, so that has to come, as I talked about before, I think it's got to be partly evidence-based and it's also got to partly be driven by the community. So, Kath Foley, I think, mentioned that evidence-based medicine isn't clinicians looking at the clinical guidelines and doing what they're told. It's, what does the evidence say, and then using your clinical expertise to apply it. So it should be the same with communities. Like, what evidence have we got around what works in communities? And I'd say not much. So really, we should, communities are free to do whatever they want in the absence of good quality evidence to the contrary. Prioritising possible solutions, again, feels to me like a community role. And then quantifying counterfactual systems. So that's, if we're going to change something and measure the effect, you have to compare it to something, and where that hasn't happened, and that thing that you're comparing it to is what we call a counterfactual. So those evaluations things are, I think they're the roles of researchers, maybe not so much the other things. So we talked about the second one there. It means different communities will engage with different issues depending on their need. The learning systems have to learn which communities will be benefiting, which ones aren't. So if we're going to set up this learning system, we need a way of tracking, if they're trying to reduce alcohol-related A&E presentations, between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m, we need to track that and see if it's working. And as soon as it looks like it's not working, then we need to stop it and do something else. Yep, so it's a continual, let's do this, let's tweak something and measure it and test it as we go through. So I just scribbled did this extra slide this morning while I was listening to Sharon, because I thought really what Sharon was talking about, working with individual families and kids, is the same thing we could be doing in communities. So, she talked about that. If you want to engage with families, then, or, parents of kids, then you need that. She called it a snippet, but a small change that's meaningful to them. And I think that's the same thing. If you're working with communities, there's no point going in and trying to do something that makes a big change for something they're not particularly interested in. If you go in there and you say, we need to fix your methamphetamine problem, and they don't care about that, then you straight away got this kind of misalignment. I think that third bullet point, the problem with that is, as a researcher, no matter what the data says, we've got to go in there and say, well, you tell us what the problem is, we'll see if we can work on it, and then we're going to get some money to do what you want to do. Very hard for researchers to be letting go or, giving up that level of control. But I should say, they've all been in the media at the moment, the ABC doing this national survey thing, and, the one reassuring thing for us, sorry, this is probably very hard to see, but I don't think drug and alcohol problems will be very far, you don't have to go very far below the surface of the community to find drug and alcohol problems. And this, I thought was quite incredible. That's the, whatever the sort of accuracy of this survey, drug and alcohol's ranked as the third most important issue that households in Australia are worried about. And, we all think that everyone's worried about petrol prices, but really, it's drug and alcohol is the third one there. So I think, particularly in rural and regional communities where I've worked a lot, there's sort of all sorts of things, manifestations of problems, and a lot of it comes back to drug and alcohol issues. So I don't think we have to worry too much about letting communities tell us what their problems are, because it won't be long before we get to the drug and alcohol issues. And I'll just finish with that one. After about a decade, it's still my favourite cartoon.